Good afternoon. I'm sorry that my throat is a little hoarse, but things happened over the weekend. Basically, what I'm going to do today is make the business case for Argentina.
Mostrar a Argentina como un caso de negocio.
And why it is an excellent opportunity to invest in Argentina. So, when one wants to make an evaluation, the key value drivers are that there is a business that generates free cash flow, above the risk-free return, and that there is growth opportunities. Basically, those are the key value drivers that one finds in any conventional evaluation. So, basically, what I'm going to do is tell you why Argentina is an excellent business case, and why those who bet on Argentina are going to keep winning. I'm going to start from economic growth so that we understand the logic of how all this engineering works. The essential logic of economic growth had already been described by Adam Smith in his research on the nature and cause of wealth in nations. In fact, in book 4, he had a sketch of a growth model. Therefore, I continue to maintain that Adam Smith is to economics as what Gauss is to mathematics, someone who was 200 years ahead of his time. And the reality is that all the elements were within there in chapter 4. Then came Malthus and refuted it, and that in light of the empirical evidence at that time, the work in terms of growth then is revived in the mid-30s. But not as a problem to explain growth. 19.03003 but not as a problem to explain growth. We saw that we were falling into another disaster. But the strength of the data led to the fact that in 1956 two economists separately, Robert Solow on the one hand and Trevor Swan on the other, developed what we know today as the neoclassical growth model. That basically corrected some of the problems that his predecessors had in the 30s. Harrod, and in the 40s, Domar. And in that context, from that model, we proceed to the empirical evaluation of it. And it was a model basically centered on the accumulation of capital. And the problem is that when the model was tested in 1957 by Robert Solow himself, it only explained 15%. That is, the accumulation of capital per capita only explained 15%. Faced with that situation, the problem was that it was missing within that waste. A fairly particular definition of waste. Because if it is 85%, it is like it is a too large number to call it waste. And I come up with other analogies, but I'm not going to do them. With people who love a lot. So those two groups live in the Andes, but I am not going to mention them. But then, from the University of Chicago, in the economics department led by George Stigler, he suggests to Solow to incorporate human capital. And in Chicago itself, two lines of research appear.
Una probablemente la que todos más
One probably the one that everyone knows the most,
investigación micro, que es Gary
which is the micro line of research, which is Gary Becker, with his theory of human capital, and another less known, which is the line of Hiroshima Show.
que se cubre el aspecto
Hiroshima Show, which covers the aspect from the macroeconomic,
que es muy interesante y muy valioso para
which is very interesting and very valuable to explain growth.
interesante. Por ejemplo, es que Hirofumi Usawa
But also the interesting thing, for example, is that Hiroshima Show was the one who tutored the doctoral thesis of Miguel Sadrowski.
Argentina.
He was probably one of the 5 best economists in Argentine history.
Básicamente, cuando
And basically when the counter alternative that is done from MIT
el progreso tecnológico y el cual venía exógeno,
was exogenous technological progress,
podía arreglar el modelo, pero digamos,
then the model could be fixed, the truth.
digamos, era muy pobre para explicarlo.
It was very poor explanation because everything came exogenous.
Por esas cosas de la academia, digamos, esa fue
For those things of the economy, that was a line that dominated.
la literatura del crecimiento estaba.
And there in the 70s, the literature of growth was disappearing.
Y
And in the 80s, with the doctoral thesis of Paul Römer,
Paul Romer, que hace no mucho
who not long ago has been awarded with the Nobel Prize in Economics,
desarrolla la teoría del crecimiento endógeno,
develops the theory of endogenous growth,
pues,
and that is later raised by Robert Lucas Jr.
y en las lecturas del
And in the readings of the doctoral thesis of Römer in 83,
que es tutoriada justamente por
which was tutored by Robert Lucas Jr.,
el trabajo de Robert Lucas Jr.
and the work of Robert Lucas Jr. is in the readings of Lionel Robin in 85.
De ahí empieza toda la literatura del crecimiento.
From there, all the literature of economic growth begins.
David,
In 1989, Gregory Mankiw, David Weil, and David Römer
y David Romer lo que hacen es testear este
what they do is test this model,
y en ese modelo
and in that model they find that by incorporating human capital,
se pasa a explicar el 85%. Es
they
decir,
go on to explain 85%, that is 70 percentage points, because of human capital,
quiere
and
decir
this means that we did not come here to improvise,
que nosotros siempre estuvimos
that we were always present in our heads of growth,
porque una de las grandes novedades que
because one of the great novelties that we have to show the world
es básicamente nuestro Ministerio de Capital Humano.
is our Ministry of Human Capital.
Apareció en
The Ministry of Human Capital did not appear in March or April of this year.
antes de que llegáramos al gobierno,
It existed before we took over the government,
de los ministerios más importantes que tenemos.
and one of the most important ministries that we have is the Ministry of Human Capital.
El capital humano
Human capital is very important for growth,
para el crecimiento y tiene dos tipos de
and it has 2 types of human capital.
tiene lo que se llama el capital humano de primera
It has what is called the human capital of the first generation,
gente se alimenta
which is basically that people have food in good health,
salud y lo que es el
and what is the human capital of the second generation that has to do with education.
Esto es muy importante tenerlo en cuenta porque
This is very important to keep in mind, because when one looks at the history of humanity,
esto es muy importante.
which is also another very important element,
Básicamente el PBI per cápita hasta el año
basically the GDP per capita until the year 1800 was practically constant.
de hecho si tomamos desde el
In fact, if we take from the beginning of the questionnaire until 1800,
PBI per cápita era
the GDP per capita growth rate was 0.2%.
es decir, se necesitaban 3.500
That is 3,500 years were needed to be able to double the GDP per capita.
siglo XIX aparece una fuerte aceleración
Now, in the 19th century, a strong acceleration of the GDP per capita growth rate pace
donde
and jumps to 0.66%, where more than 2/3 of that is explained
porque la gente empezó a alimentarse y por lo
because people began to have an adequate food supply,
obras de saneamiento.
and so everything has to do with water in sanitation
Pero
works.
eso no quedó ahí, digamos, en
But that didn't stay there.
la parte del
In the first part of the 20th century,
siglo en términos per cápita 1,1
the economy grew by 1.1% per capita, that is, it accelerated again.
lo que es en la segunda parte del siglo XX creció al
And in the second part of the 20th century, it grew by 2.1%.
quiere decir que pasamos a 35
And that means it took 35 years to double the GDP per capita.
eso, sino que además
But not only that, if you examine national accounts,
las cuentas nacionales suelen subestimar los efectos del progreso tecnológico.
They usually underestimate the effects of technological progress, and it can be as much as 0.5%. That is, we could be traveling at rates of 3.5 per capita. That is, every 20 years we can double the GDP per capita. That puts us in a situation of well-being and wealth as never seen in the history of humanity. But hidden in there is another extremely important idea, which is the idea of growing performance. If you look until the year 1800, 800 million human beings lived on the planet. And by the year 2000, it had multiplied by, it was about 6,400 million human beings. In fact, today we are already passing 8,000 million human beings, which is also an extremely important and positive element for economic growth. Because when the population expands, that facilitates the division of work. That is one of the wonderful things that Adam Smith, when he speaks of the pin factory, which is the representation of growing performance, is said that productivity gain that can be generated has a limit. That is, a single person produced 20 pins. But if they started the activity with 18 people, the production per capita jumped to 5,000 pins. Of course, now what is the limit going to be? If you can sell all those pins, I say because they are going to have to sell 90,000 pins. Then it is like the limit where it is. It is in the size of the market. That is what Adam Smith said. The division of work is limited by the size of the market. Therefore, the role of the population is fundamental in economic growth. I see that for everything that was the 2030 agenda, and everything that is the agenda of progress. But well, now they are realizing that they missed the chance to attack the family, to attack the two lives. And now we are paying for it with falling the birth rate. Now the fear is that the world will remain unruly. If they had thought about it before, well, quite a few murders in the womb of mothers. But apart from some criminal issues, the important thing here is the presence of growing performance. As a concept with the other, we can no longer do anything but improve it forward, and which we also work. And the importance of the growing performance is that the counterpart. If one looks at it in terms of economic theory, very concentrated structures, that is, monopolies. Supposedly, for the neoclassical theory, they are bad. This is wrong. Now, it is strange to believe something like that. If we multiply by more than 8 times, or 10 times the size of the population, a number of extreme poor people went from 95% to 5, who would think that what it is linked to is bad? That is, you just have to be an idiot economist to say something like that. So, in that criterion, what one realizes is that, well, the problems of a neoclassical economy have to do with adapting the entire structure of the economy to mathematics and not the other way around. That is, putting the cart in front of the horses. But look at the madness that the neoclassical economics is reached. That when what one sees the data does not coincide with the model. They call it market failure, which is arrogant. In reality, any of you who do business, and the model does not map with real life, do not get angry with real life. I mean, you can insult whatever you want. But I mean, they change the model, don't they? I mean, they don't try to force the reality to the model. Now, the counterpoint of this is that when economists are obsessed with this, the counterpoint is that they regulate. And when they regulate, they kill the growing yields. And when they kill the growing yields, they kill the economic growth. And this is also interesting. For this, he stifled us with improvisation. We have, since the middle of last year, a Ministry of Deregulation. We could call it the Ministry of Grind Yields, the ministry that simplifies people's lives, the ministry that repowers growth. And the most interesting thing is that Federico was not a minister before, because he was teaching at Harvard, and he preferred to be more of an outsider. But if you look at the launch, I don't know if it was from the DNU. I think it was from the DNU. Federico's behind, so he was also. All this is always stopped. In terms of growth, we aim at economic growth. So look at what things are. The most reformist government in history was the government of Menem. Today we carried out 2,000 reforms in 500 days. We are 20 times more reformist than the entire government of Menem in its entire period. And so Federico takes away regulations all day long. We also have an impressive task in human capital, because what was done there is to separate families and children. What did we say? That the first thing was food and health. The second thing was that. The first thing was food and health. So we have children and families. We had to open health because it was a very complex issue. So it deserved a ministry. Originally the plan was that it was within human capital. Then look, everything that has to do with what that does to feed and health comes. And then comes how it is reinserted in the labor market. That is why work is within human capital. Education is within human capital. So why? Because basically it is the cuts. Human capital of the second generation, either by those who have to study or by those who need to be reinserted. And that is very important, that it is also linked with what? So that in that way, let's say, there is not so much informality, and let's start to close the problem of informality. So if you like, those team ministries have a clear direction to explain 70 points of the economic growth. So what is the fundamental? Is behind economic growth? Look, the first thing is to get the Keynesian chip out of your head. Growth is not generated by consumption. Growth is generated when the labor capital relationship rises. Now, for the labor capital relationship to rise, you have to invest. And to invest, you have to finance it. And for that, you need to save. That is, those governments, like the previous ones or the populists, said that they basically wanted to stimulate consumption so that the economy would expand and not have to re-shorten the feet. Not for nothing, since 2011, we have not passed that maximum level of GDP, to which we are at 3/10. In other words, we are looking for it. And you know that when I set an objective, I am quite decisive in the search. So in that sense, what we have is that the key is saving. Now, to save, you have to protect property rights. That is why another of our policies has to do with freedom. We put respect for property rights as the highest priority, not only to protect that, but also to protect the result of those who invest. In fact, one of our policies to generate growth is the REGI, which, by the way, today, Minister Capito confirmed to me before entering, who I thank for his presence, just like Kinyao, Boris, Vladimir Werner, Javelin Ari Petit, the head of the REGI, and, well, Manekasitadisima, Crack and Germa Francos, He confirmed to me that today a mining company
por 2.000 millones de dólares.
entered a RIGI
Está funcionando.
for $2 billion.
Y ahí
That is, it is working.
que una de las cosas que
And the interesting thing is that one of the things
para mí es de mucho valor.
that is also for me
En el RIGI,
of great value
yo metí la mano ahí adentro.
is the RIGI.
Voy a contar qué es lo que hice.
In fact, I put my hand in there,
En el
so I'm going to tell you what I did.
es que hay
In the RIGI, what you have
situación económica financiera de
is that there is a respect of the economic financial accretion of the business,
el valor
which is the opposite of how you determine the value,
o determinar la tasa interna.
or if you want, to determine the internal return rate
Básicamente,
in that
ya
context.
sea si ustedes
Basically,
se encuentran
whether you are
suba de impuestos,
facing a rise in taxes,
o
with the
con
creation of taxes,
regulaciones,
or with regulations,
es cuantificable y por lo
that is
tanto, puede
quantifiable,
llevarlo a la justicia y demandar al Estado por eso.
and therefore you can take it to court
Además,
and sue the state for that.
pusimos la
In
posibilidad
addition,
de elegir entre tres
we put the possibility of choosing
instancias de arbitraje
3 international arbitration instances,
donde no solo que ahora pueden elegir el árbitro,
where not only can they now choose the arbitrator,
eso no están conformes, pueden cambiar.
but if in the middle of the process they are not satisfied, they can change it.
Un tribunal local para esto,
And we also created a local court for this,
la determinación del fallo
whose contribution to determining failure is what makes defense of competition.
hoy salió ya, digamos, también
If you are watching the networks,
de esos
you would have already seen the search
donde, digamos,
of those technical teams
unas personas
where
calificadas,
there will be some highly qualified people
pero
evaluating them.
por lo tanto, digo,
But not only that.
donde
Therefore, I am explaining
lo que tiene que ver con el
this human capital,
propiedad, con los
what it has to do with the respect
factores
of property rights,
que generan muchísimo.
with the growing returns,
Pero
all factors that generate a lot of growth.
es ahorro,
But notice that I said it is savings and investment.
bueno, hicimos mucho por el ahorro.
And what did we do for the savings?
Llegábamos
Well, we did a lot for the savings.
fiscal
We arrived and had a quasi-fiscal deficit
del tesoro
of 10 points of the GDP and a deficit of the Treasury of 5 points of the GDP. And their total appeared with a chainsaw. And after 123 years of always having deficit,
equilibrio financiero
it was the first time that we had financial balance,
vino para quedar.
and which we achieved in a month of management. And it came to stay.
Pero no solo eso. Digo,
But
nadie
not
hablaba
only
de lo
that.
que pasaba dentro del balance.
God, nobody talked about what was happening
Y esa
inside the balance of the central bank and that group of giants
la cabeza de Santiago
that say,
tenemos a Vladimir Werning,
"Oh, Santiago Borsali."
junto
And here we have Vladimir Gernin,
trabajando
together with what was being worked on
con Pablo Quirno, digamos, bajo
in the finance department with Pablo Cuadra, under the orders of Torto Capito. Incredibly, in 6 months,
la monstruosidad de los pasivos remunerados del
the
banco.
monstrosity of the passive remuneration
Y eso además
of the central bank was dismantled,
violentar los derechos de propiedad.
and that was also done without violating property rights.
Es más, en ese contexto donde
In fact, in that context,
equilibrio fiscal,
where we have gained fiscal balance,
esta idea del déficit cero tiene
this idea of deficit zero
muy importante
has a very important consequence,
de que entonces
and it is a fact that then
el es no creciente.
the debt-product relationship is not growing,
Eso implica que Argentina
and
es
consequently that implies that Argentina is solvent and that it is going to explode.
implica que
Argentina is one of the 5 countries
país
in the world that have a surplus in the financial line. Therefore, sooner or later, the interest rate is going to collapse
más tarde o
because the country risk is going to implied.
va a colapsar porque el riesgo país se va a desplomar.
And that is the reason why the interest rate is going to collapse.
Y no solo eso, sino que además,
And not only that, but also
si ustedes le estaban sacando 15
if you are taking 15 points from the GDP
y se los devuelven,
to the people and return them,
parte lo va a consumir, parte lo va a ahorrar.
obviously part of it is going to be consumed,
En diciembre del
part of it is going to be saved.
2000, hoy
Note we were discussing hyperinflation in December 2023. Today we are basically discussing mortgages at 30 years. That is, the paradigm shift is huge. But not only that, but also that in all this process, we lowered the inflation rate of coming from speeds at 54% in monthly interest rate, which implies 17,000 per year. That is, last year we ended up in less than 1%. And if we subtract the crawling peg in dollars at its deflation, surely someone could tell me the latest data showed 2.8, yes, but it also showed 2.7 consumer and 0.5 construction. They're clear about all the mess that politics generated during March and April, causing the demand for money to fall, because look how symmetrically the IPC and the IBM went up. And why? Because they left the non-transable. The demand for money fell, and they went to a transable. What had to happen with a non-transable? To fall back, what happened? The construction is down. Look how the effect of the impact in the demand for money was immediately noticed. About what the inflation rate was. Again, we did not worry, because inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon, and we have fixed the amount of money since mid last year, and since the fallback of monetary policy can be from 18 to 24 months. What I am also going to assure you, that since we are not going to emit, what is the consequence of this? For the middle of next year, there is no more inflation. Moreover, against all the focus that said that by making a 15% adjustment of the GDP, we were going to drop by at least 15 points. Because they said yes, they managed to lower the inflation, but they are going to lower the economy into the Great Depression. Then they started with the Great Depression, then with the L, then with next pipe. Leave next pipe. Well, then it fell in B, as we said. And in the end it ended up being a tilde, because despite having made the greatest adjustment, the economy grew by 6%, because if you look at December against December, in the most stationized, the GDP was 6 points above. That is, not only did we make a huge adjustment, we lowered the inflation, and we also managed to increase the economy. And in addition to all this, the cruel evil tyrants and horrible liberal libertarians took out more than 10 million people from poverty. And on the other hand, the effect of the tax balance was quantified by a very prestigious Argentine economist who is called Nicolini, Juan Pablo Nicolini. He is a professor at Italia, and he works for the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis, and made estimates for different countries on how the public accounts impact the economy. And the interesting thing about this is that for the Argentine case, a fiscal adjustment, a fiscal framework like the one we have, implies at least a rate of 4% per capita. It is a huge number, huge, because they think that in 17 years, we could have in 17 years, we could be doubling the GDP per capita. Now, the reality, as Juan Pablo Nicolini says, that is about tax balance, but nothing says how it was achieved. And in that sense, it is interesting because we, instead of doing it as any politician would have done, devaluing, or let's say liquefying the spending and generating deep redistributions of income, making the number of poor fly, or raising taxes. We are the first government in history that does it by making a fiscal adjustment, lowering the public spending by more than 30%. In fact, we even gave ourselves the luxury of lowering taxes. We lowered more than 19 taxes. Today we announce low taxes, and in the case of fine harvest, the prolongation of the lower taxes until March next year, not the rest. So basically we continue lowering taxes. Our plan is to continue lowering taxes. In fact, Turtle, the other day made a presentation by Free Grim to 6% in 2 mandates. If US, we estimate that we could retain about $450 billion, and that if we grew to 8, we can retain $550 billion, but not a leader. Have we made the adjustment? Lowering the size of the state, that will generate much more growth. If you count the structural reforms, there will be more growth. Then we go to a context of high growth rates, of less positive pressure, of a huge respect of the property rights, because our agenda is to be the freest country in the world. The freest countries are 12 times richer than the repressed. They have 50 times less. Are the poor in the extreme format. They grow twice as fast. The tax rate is exploding. With the fall of the country's risk, we are doing a huge job. In terms of human capital, in times of deregulation, a huge task. In times of the respect at the right of property and security, in charge of the Minister of Security and the Minister Petty in defense. Therefore, what I want to tell you is that we are facing a wonderful case of growth. Let's say this is the opportunity to take advantage of it, because in these conditions, in 30 years, Argentina could become one of the first world powers, where 2/3 of that improvement occurs in the first third. That is, it happens in 10 years. Therefore, it is an excellent opportunity to buy Argentina, because this is very cheap, and Argentina is going to rise as a bus stop. Long live freedom, damn it.